And we're back in the studio like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your hopefully happy hump day here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Alas, this is a history-based memory type of episode, and it's not a happy, upbeat episode. So I apologize if you've been having a happy hump day. I don't mean to bring your mood down, but 9 years ago today, it was actually technically 9 years ago yesterday, saw the passing of Muhammad Ali, who, if you've been with the channel even for a couple of months, you know he's my single favorite historical figure ever. The most fascinating, kind of galvanizing, polarizing personality, maybe of the 20th century. Maybe as far as Americans, we're not going to name another one, but he was somebody who came on the scene like a flash of lightning in a pretty dark period for the United States. And, the joke is it's always a pretty dark period for the United States, depending on how you see things. But I don't really have an explanation for why. I don't have a why, because there are people older than myself. There are people of my dad's generation, the silent generation. Dad was not a boomer, neither was my mother, or is my mother, I should say. The boomers began in 46. And if you ever wondered and didn't Google, why is it called baby boomers? It simply means it was post-World War II and people who were born after the war. So there are many boomers and some members of what is known as the silent generation, for whom the passing of Ali was as devastating as when John Lennon was assassinated, which is totally, completely different. In the case of Lennon, it's because he was still so young. But in the case of Ali, it was because he was so much more than just a boxer. But as somebody who was too young to have ever seen him fight, I mean, his last two fights were travesties that should never have been allowed to happen. I was 6 and 7 years old when he fought the last two times against Larry Holmes, which was just a disaster all around. And then Trevor Berbick, which, I mean, it's almost absurd to say, but he gives a really good account of himself, given the fact that he was sick. He was falling apart physically and neurologically, and he still somehow managed to be competitive with a guy who 5 years later won the World Heavyweight Championship. That's just completely bonkers. But as for how someone such as myself became such a fan in the first place, I mean, the only real answer is when I was about 5 years old, my dear old dad, the C in SCF & Co., but long before SCF & Co. was a going concern, as they say in the businesses, he was a partner, a junior partner. The joke is there are certain companies that there's nothing more junior than being a junior partner. Well, Dad was a junior partner at a big firm, which will not be named in this space at this particular time, because they're a bit of a notorious name. No, they're not. It's not Bernie Madoff or anything like that. Dad was a CPA, was not in the financial, specifically was not a financial guy, even though he worked in finance technically as a CPA. But he worked for this big firm where all of the employees, this was like the first iteration of people working in cubicles. And Dad had his own office. That was the only real good thing about being a junior partner, because the senior partners were, spoiler alert, taking too much of what the junior partners were doing. The junior partners worked their dicks off, as Dad's old buddy Hal Shulman, Hal's still around, they worked their tails off. And they didn't make as much as they should have, because the senior partners were lighting victory cigars and taking too big of a percentage. But on a random Saturday in tax season 1980, now, Ali was retired by this point. So I'm 6 years old, and I think the office was maybe a block away from Grand Central Station. I'm not sure. Could have been 370 Mad. I don't know. But it was a big office, and Dad took me to work with him. Bring your son to work day. But it was tax season, so this was a Saturday. And I guess he asked me, hey, would you like to, I'm going to drive in, would you like to come with me today? And I said, sure. I would have been in kindergarten at this point in time. Now, even an allegedly intelligent, bright child such as myself, I needed something to keep me company. I needed something to do. And another spoiler alert, in 1980, there were no smartphones. Everything was still, well, almost everything was still rotary. There were computers. There were a number of computers in the office, but they really were not for use by the son of one of the junior partners. I'm not going to sit there playing Pac-Man, or it wouldn't be Pac-Man. They had a computer. Because it was called a DeckMate. It was a Digital Equipment Corporation. It was a Ken Olsen old dinosaur computer from the mid 70s. Yeah, what a joke. The thing was enormous. That's what she said. But they had a game on this computer that I loved. It was called DeckMate Dan. DeckMate Dan. It was Digital Equipment Corporation's version of Pac-Man. I got such a kick out of it. But instead of it being a Pac-Man, it was this guy that was known as DeckMate Dan. Gobble, 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 gobble. But anyway, so this one day, I'm looking for something to do. Dad gives me a couple of issues of Sports Illustrated, Sport Magazine, but I mean, it's not really working. So one of the other junior partners, a really nice guy named Marshall, was the first person that I had met whose name was Marshall. He wasn't Marshall Dillon on TV or anything like that. So Marshall said, he was talking to my father, said, I understand your son is interested in boxing. I have a couple of maybe boxing issues that I have in my office. Maybe he would like to read those. So that's great. Thanks, Marshall. So this guy Marshall gives me these 3 magazines, like Inside Boxing, Boxing Illustrated, Ring Magazine, I think were the 3. And all 3 of them it was some sort of Muhammad Ali commemorative collector issue. It was something like my cap here, but that's different. This was a collector's comic between Muhammad Ali and Superman. This was DC Comics. It was penned and inked by people who work for DC Comics, not people in the boxing world. But the artwork is unbelievable. They took actual pictures of Ali and stenciled, and it's really beautiful work. The comic itself is just okay. It's very funny and sometimes unintentionally funny. Ali beating the shit out of an alien who outweighs him by 500 pounds. I mean, it's some great stuff. And he beats Superman to within an inch of his life. I mean, he just absolutely obliterates the Man of Steel, who is not superpowered, obviously, when he fights a mortal. Well, let's just see what happens when these guys go into the ring, and Superman just gets crushed. But he doesn't give up. And then when he gets his powers back, in an eighth of a second, suddenly he's ready to move waters, with his eyes or whatever it is that he does. But these 3 magazines, I was very young, 6 years old. And the stories that I read, it felt like they were coming to life for me. I felt like I knew this guy. And he had retired after defeating Leon Spinks in the return fight. He shouldn't have been fighting at that point. You can argue that his best time to retire would have been after he beat Foreman in Zaire. But you know what? George probably squared him up enough times where he was going to have some kind of neuro damage and something that was going to follow him in later years. But for sure, he should not have fought after Manila, and neither should Joe Frazier. But that's beside the point. By 1979, 1980, it seemed that he was done. He wasn't going to fight anymore. There wasn't any reason. And, he just had that sort of indomitable will. He just wanted to keep going out there. There were rumors that, maybe Don King had stolen some of his money. I think it was more Elijah Muhammad and, not Elijah Muhammad, Herbert Muhammad. There were rumors that Herbert Muhammad was taking more than he was supposed to. But Ali definitely thought that Don King had screwed him over. I don't remember him publicly talking about Herbert Muhammad being a problem. But it's not really that important to this story. But he was retired, and these were retrospective. Ali as a young man, the fact that when he was 12, he had his bike stolen. That's how he got into boxing. He wasn't somebody who just automatically had this incredible talent for boxing and then was trained. He was a random kid from Louisville. And this is something that Mike Tyson has talked about. Tyson and Ali, there are a lot of parallels, but they're not really direct parallels. They're more indirect. Yeah, they're both undisputed heavyweight champions and in their primes appeared unbeatable. But that's not really. Tyson had a much more hardscrabble upbringing. He's talked about it. He said, and he always called Ali the champ. He was never not complimentary, respectful. He loved the guy. He always called him the champ. But he said, the champ grew up differently than I did. He had a middle-class upbringing. His father, Cassius Clay Sr., was a sign painter, and he was pretty good. He probably, if he'd had greater, societal advantages, he could have actually been a painter, not just a sign painter. But he had whatever a middle-class upbringing was, late 40s, early 50s in Louisville, that's what Ali had. So with these 3 magazines, I got a broad survey of his existence, his triumphs, his tragedies, and things that went right, things that went wrong. And there was already a sense that he had fought for too long, and that he had sustained, significant damage that really wasn't necessary. And then he fought twice more. But what you can't really fathom, what you can't grasp, why did it make such an impression on me? I don't know. Maybe it was the way that these magazines presented his, when he really became polarizing, the stance that he took during Vietnam, that he basically shrugged his shoulders and said, I'm not supporting this war, this BS war. We're supposed to fight people that, they never called me any names. He said it in a more colorful way than that. They never called me any names. You're telling me that's my enemy, but I got places in my hometown I'm not allowed to go to. So which enemy are we talking about here? Not going. Well, in his case, he wasn't actually going to fight in Vietnam. He was going to propagandize the war in much the manner that his forebear, the great Joe Louis, did in World War II. But that was a just war. There are very few people right now. There's some that might take issue with dropping nukes. Okay, that's a debate. That's a philosophical question. But there were very few people who would stand on business and say the United States just should have stayed out of World War II entirely. Even after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we just should have let it happen and no problem. No. It's a question of the methodology of the war. And there were a lot of people who did not believe what we were doing in Vietnam. And Ali was one of them. He couldn't understand it. And when they explained to him, so listen, you only need to make 3 appearances a year. They actually had negotiations. Just make 3 appearances a year. You don't even have to talk it up that much, but you have to give enough of a sense that we're fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them back home. He just couldn't do it. He couldn't in good conscience do it. There was something about that. The fact that this guy, and I was so young, I was 5, 6 years old, but something resonated with me. That this was somebody who was already incredibly successful, multimillionaire at such a young age, 24 and then 25 when this was going on. He's in the prime of his life, the prime of his athletic career prowess. He'd made 9 title defenses. The only title defense that was even competitive really was the Mildenberger fight, because Carl was a fucking bruiser. And Mildenberger caught him with a couple of body shots that, you hate to say it, if it's a different fighter, he's losing the title. Ali, unfortunately, from the historical perspective of his health, he took shots to the head maybe as well as any other fighter in history. Because when you're a heavyweight and you get rattled, when you get blasted by the hardest hitters in boxing history, you're not supposed to be able to eat those punches and keep moving forward. But to some extent, he was able to do that. But he took body punches just as well. There's a funny clip. It's not really that funny, but it's funny the way he says it. There's a clip of the 2 all-time greats, Andre Ward and Bernard Hopkins, talking about when Hopkins beat De La Hoya. And he says, people are always talking about how Oscar just stayed down. He said, you get hit in the liver. Human beings are not supposed to get hit there. You're not supposed to take any kind of anything in the liver. It's supposed to be protected at all times. You get hit there, it's going to take you some time to be able to breathe again. Well, in Zaire, Foreman hit Ali in the liver with a shot that should have ended the fight, and somehow, 5 seconds later, Ali shouted at George, "Is that all you got?" And George said, "Well, that's when I knew I wasn't winning that fight." But he was just wired differently. He was wired differently. And he didn't understand the why. So he threw his career away. And I say, the only tough fight he had was Mildenberger, but he won every round of that fight anyway. He was a dominant force. Now, there are levels of dominance. You compare Ali to George Foreman, his, rival turned best friend, and Tyson. And what you see is his dominance was different. Ali's dominance had a certain poetry and artistry. The phrase "float like a butterfly, sting like a bee" was kind of how he fought. His process was move around the ring, usually with his hands down, move around the ring. There was the grace of it, the beauty of it, the poetry of it, and move in at certain points in time. But there are fights in the 60s where he's simply walking his opponent down. He's not dancing around the ring like he does with Cleveland Williams. But even in the Williams fight, he dances around in the first round, And then at a certain point in the second round, when he drops Williams, he doesn't do that anymore. He says, okay, I got a hurt fighter, I'm going to end the fight. It's not like he only had one way. He had a lot of different things that he did and could do. And I got this out of those articles. So he was away from the sport for 3.5 years. And it stuck in my craw, even as a kid. Why did he get in trouble for this? Why did he get in trouble for this? That war was wrong. I understood at that age. This was not an okay war. This is not World War II. It's just not. What were we doing there? And as I got older, there was even more of you look into it, you learn about it in school. What were we doing there? And why did they come down so hard on him? And then when you get a lot older and you see the number of famous people, some presidents of the United States, who actually dodged the draft, who actually refused to serve their country in any capacity, well, how the hell did that happen? You don't want to get into racial politics, but it's very suspicious who got in the most trouble, even though he wasn't even going over there to fight, but simply because he did not play ball with the establishment. So all of this stuff is what first got me interested, and I didn't have the ability to put those level of thoughts together, but something struck me as terribly unjust. And I got the idea when he came back, and he only came back because the Supreme Court, the Earl Warren Court, for crying out loud, that's the most conservative, you want to talk now? That was the most conservative Supreme Court we've ever had. And it was unanimous in his favor that he'd gotten fucked. The system tried to chew him up and spit him out. But he was able to weather the storm. He had enough money, and Joe Frazier, his future rival, helped him out. He probably gave him $50,000. Nobody talked about it at the time. That didn't come out until later. I don't think it came out till Ali's autobiography, a lot of which was fabricated, let's just say. Not that, it's a fun read, and the movie is entertaining. It's also not that great. Will Smith did a better job playing Ali than Ali, but what are you going to do? But when he came back, he wasn't the same. And what I got from all of these incredible action pictures of the fights is that he had a certain indomitable will, a certain spirit that you didn't necessarily see in the 60s because he won so easily. And George Foreman, the parallel with George also, is that George had so many easy fights in his early career, nobody knew how badly he burned to win. And that sometimes doesn't come out until a person's skills have dulled a little bit. But the point I made earlier about Ali, the artistry and the beauty, contrasted with Foreman, who was an absolute dreadnought. He was a dreadnought in the ring. There's almost no other word to use to describe what he was. He was a wrecking ball. Mike Tyson was a different kind of dreadnought. Tyson was smaller. He was more compact. He didn't hit quite as hard as George by his own admission. George was just a bigger guy. George didn't seem to deliver punches as quickly. He certainly didn't throw punches as fast as Tyson. But when George hit the target, it did more damage. You know, Mike doesn't have that many or didn't have that many one-punch KOs on his record. He doesn't have anything like the Michael Moorer with George, who was already 45 years old. He almost had it with Buster Douglas. But dominance comes in different forms. As I said, there's the Tyson kind of dominance. There's the George Foreman steamrolling, undefeated, all-time great, and Joe Frazier just crushed him in 73 when Joe was undefeated. And then there is the kind of magic of Ali moving around and not boxing really like a heavyweight, boxing like a welterweight, but packing the power of a heavyweight. So in the 70s, he was a little slower, but he had this unbreakable spirit where whatever fear he felt, this is what I do for a living, let's fucking go. And he lost a couple of fights. He lost 2 fights. He lost to Frazier in his 3rd fight back from exile. That was his first defeat. Tough fight. You know, Joe scored a knockdown in the last round to kind of seal it. If Joe had not scored that, like if we reboot the Matrix and the 15th round is close, Joe was going to win the decision. But if without that knockdown, I'm telling you, it would have been very controversial. Because if you watch the first 14 rounds, there were some people that actually would have had Ali, maybe he's ahead 8-6, maybe he's ahead, 7-6 with one even. Because there were rounds where Joe landed, Joe just hit harder. He landed the bigger shots. But Ali was peppering him. Frazier's face was a mess at the end of the fight. Ali had a huge welt on his jaw. I don't know how his jaw didn't get broken in that fight. Frazier landed at least a dozen hellacious, with other fighters, fight-ending left hooks. Frazier was just an absolute bruiser in there. So he lost a couple of fights, and then he had the incredible comeback fight. Well, it wasn't really a comeback fight. He had won his last 2 fights. He beat Norton, he beat Frazier in a return, and then he beat George in Zaire. And what I got, even as a small boy, his defeat of Foreman is what made him legend. He already was considered somewhat of a legend, but that put it over the top. That was the one where if he had retired, people already would have said this has got to be considered the best heavyweight who ever lived. We just watched George destroy the 2 people who beat him. How did he win? And there's only one moment in the fight where you even think Ali's in trouble. It's in the 5th round when George lands this incredible body shot that I was saying that should have folded him. He should have been folded by that shot. It wasn't. He wasn't. No problem. I don't even know how much it hurt. I don't know how he wasn't screaming in pain, assuming his legs didn't short circuit, which obviously they didn't. But he won that fight, and then he had the Wepner fight, and I didn't make the connection with Rocky because the first title defense was the Wepner fight, which was Sylvester Stallone's inspiration for writing Rocky. And then he fought then he fought Ron Lyle. Tremendous performance. Another great fighter from the 70s. And then there was the Thrilla in Manila. And neither Joe Frazier nor Ali were anywhere close to their best. They weren't even close to what they had been in the return fight in 74. Ali was so much faster in that fight. And I would say that his 2 best performances in the 70s in terms of how lean he looked and how fast he was, the return fight with Norton and the second fight with Frazier, where both guys were in such great shape. They're moving and pursuing in the 12th round like it's early in the fight. What cardio they had. Incredible. So at that point of his career after Frazier, there was the sense that he needed to walk away. He needed to walk away. And one thing that you really can't explain, because there is so much about the brain that we don't understand, just as lay people, not as neurologists, just as lay people. There are fighters who took enormous amounts of punishment, enormous number of blows to the head, heavy concussive blows to the head. And you listen to them speak years after their retirement, you wouldn't even know they were boxers. You listen to Chris Eubank Sr., who speaks so beautifully. Now, yeah, it's true that Eubank mostly beat the crap out of his opponents, but he had a number of fights where he took a lot of shots. He looks like a statesman. He doesn't look like a guy who was not just a professional fighter, he was an absolute killer in the ring. I mean, he could be one of the top 10, middleweights or in that range. He was a monster fighter. And you look at George Foreman. In his return, in his comeback, I mean, Evander Holyfield, you could argue, beat the hell out of him mostly for 12 rounds, but George was in there throwing. And George certainly took a lot of punches from Michael Moorer, who maybe wasn't the greatest heavyweight, but Moorer landed a lot of shots. The Alex Stewart fight in 92, George took a pretty good pounding there, even though he won the Axel Schultz fight. George Foreman's speech remained steady until near the end of his life, or at the end of his life, as far as I know. There's just no way to explain these things. And you look at a lot of the UFC guys, the horrible poundings they take, most of them sound great. That's good. And that's one reason, as counterintuitive as it is, when people say UFC short-term is not safer than boxing, but long-term it seems to be, because most of the fights are over the first time a person gets squared up. And that's the thing. You look at Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis lost 2 fights. Both of them were what amounted to flash knockdowns / knockouts. It was not a sustained battering where, he was getting beat up and it ended up winning the fight or something like that. They were quick. He got concussed and the fight was stopped. That kind of thing. Rahman, a huge hitter, and Oliver McCall, another huge monster hitter. Not necessarily, they weren't great fighters. I mean, they were great fighters by normal person standards. Heavyweight champion in the standard, they were both heavyweight champions, McCall because he beat Lewis, and Rahman because he beat Lewis. But there was a sense as the 70s unfolded that he was slowing down. And that's where you start to get into the question of, shouldn't somebody have just said, you can't fight anymore? But if you keep passing the tests, you keep passing the mental acuity tests and whatever it was they were doing in the 70s, he kept getting licensed to fight. And he didn't need it. I don't really think that he needed the money. He just didn't want to walk away. He enjoyed the crowds too much, and there was something in him. He always felt that he was going to win, that he could do it. And he said in later years, the only time he really thought he was going to lose was after the first round of the Holmes fight, because he wasn't well physically, and not just because of the fact that he was compromised up to, at that point, their early stage of Parkinson's were probably starting to show. It was the fact that he actually was sick. It was the flu, it was something. So on top of everything else, he could barely move in the ring and he could barely throw punches. He said after the first round, he said, I'm screwed here. But the other thing he said was, I wasn't going to quit. Larry was going to have to they were all going to have to carry me out of there on a stretcher. Not only was I not going to quit, I wasn't even going down. Larry's just going to keep hitting me. I don't give a shit. I'm staying out here. I signed up for this. I'm going to do it. That was just how he was wired. So I do remember when he fought Berbick. I didn't see it live, but I was happy that he didn't. I guess I was 7 at that point. It was December of 1981. I was just happy he didn't take a bad beating, because the Holmes fight, Holmes landed a lot of shots, but Larry was pulling his punches after a certain point. He didn't want to hurt him. He loved the guy. And Larry has talked about this repeatedly. He hasn't specifically dispelled the idea of Mike Tyson getting Holmes for Ali, but Larry loved Ali. I mean, they worked together for a number of years. He said, Ali was the guy who taught me how to fight. I had talent, but he taught me how to take it to the next level. And he also said that until 1976, Ali could have beaten him. He said the Ali of Manila may have been slower, so I'm not sure I would have beat him in 75. The 78 Larry Holmes probably beats the Ali of Manila. But again, those are just the sort of fun arguments that boxing fans love to have. But I would say that as early as, let's say 1982 or 83, there was a sense that not only had he stayed too long, because we see fighters all the time who stay too long, but they're still able to live their normal lives, even if they're a step slower. And you look at football players, you look at hockey players with the concussions. It's different, but it's the same concept, that there are people who have been wounded so badly, they get headaches, like Al Toon, the former New York Jets. What a great wide receiver he was, where your life is compromised going forward, even though you're still, relatively speaking, so young. And the only time that I was ever in the room with my lifelong idol, my hero, my inspiration, even though I didn't box. I had a heavy bag in the basement, but I never learned how to box. I just liked the sport. I was a fan. When it was aired, I loved to watch old fights. ESPN would occasionally do so. And then when ESPN2 and ESPN Classic, this was, before YouTube, I would always look to see, is Hagler Hearns going to be on, that kind of thing. The only time I was ever in the same room as Ali, WrestleMania 1 at Madison Square Garden. I was one of I think there were 19,000 plus fans in attendance that day. It was an early pay-per-view event, but my mother managed to get tickets through my cousin Ira, who was one of my it's my dad's first cousin, it's my dad's first cousin. He worked in advertising, and I don't know how he was able to swing such great seats. He refused to even charge my mother. Maybe someone owed him a favor. The tickets sold out immediately. The old days of Ticketmaster, one of those, they sold out immediately. We got tickets. We were about 300 feet from the ring, dead center in the ring. They were incredible seats. And I could see that he was down there, but I wasn't really close enough to even yell at him or something like that. But he played an integral role in the final match, the tag team match between Hulk Hogan and Mr. T against Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff. It was such a joke. It wasn't even that great of a card, wrestling-wise, but to see him in person, to listen to the crowd chant his name one last time at Madison Square Garden. And how many times did he fight at the Garden? He fought Sonny Banks in 62. That was his first time at the Garden. First time he was knocked down. Little trivia, Muhammad Ali only took 3 clean knockdowns in his professional career. Sonny Banks in 62, Henry Cooper in 63, Joe Frazier in 71. So 2 of the 3 clean knockdowns took place at Madison Square Garden, the world's most famous arena. But he fought Sonny Banks, beat him. He took the knockdown, jumped up, knocked Banks down about 20 seconds later. He wasn't hurt. He was more surprised and embarrassed that he hit the canvas in New York. He fought Doug Jones, tough fight. That was also before he won the title at the Garden. He fought Zora Foley at the Garden in 67, Oscar Bonavena in 70, Joe Frazier in 71. I think he might have fought Patterson there in 72. I'm not sure about that. The second fight with Patterson. And then the second fight with Frazier, he fought at Madison Square Garden in 74. And the last fight he had at the Garden, it was when he beat Ernie Shavers, which is a fight that should not have happened. And there is a school of thought, and I think Larry Holmes kind of hinted at this, that says it was the Shavers fight that unfortunately is what compromised Ali going forward. That if he had just not taken that beating from Ernie, I mean, he may have been a little slower. He may not have been as coordinated, but Ernie hit him harder, and it was more of a sustained, it was 15 rounds. Now, Ali won the fight. He did enough in the early rounds, and, Ernie had the huge punch, but there were certain rounds that he would just load up, and might give those rounds away. But that was his last fight at the Garden. He was 35, and again, he had no business being out there. It's unfortunate, but that was a terrible pounding that he took. But he showed the spirit. The end of the 14th round of that fight, he's all but slumped onto his stool like you wondered, could he even continue? But he was far ahead on points. That was that crazy situation where ABC showed the scores in between rounds. I still can't believe they did that. They showed the scores in between rounds. And Ali knew that he had an insurmountable lead in his corner. Angelo Dundee, Bundini Brown, they were telling him, hold him, do whatever you have to do. You just have to survive the last 3 minutes. You can't lose by decision. Just don't get knocked out. Don't give the ref a chance to stop, whatever they said to him in the corner. But sometime in the 1 minute, as he was preparing for round 15, something came to him. He suddenly had his energy. It just, like he got a third or a fourth win. And he said, no, I'm going to knock him out. I'm knocking him out. Let's go. And he got up, and he was this close to stopping Ernie in the 15th round. That's the last great round that he fought, realistically. Going into 15th, Ernie even said it. So I thought I had him. I'm looking at him. He barely made it back to his corner at the end of the 14th. I still felt good. He came out in the 15th like it was the third round. And Ernie kind of chuckled when he recounted that story. But his health it deteriorated like year to year. He looked older than he was. And for somebody who was considered such an attractive, a really good-looking guy, he didn't age well. And by the time he was 50, like he almost felt like he needed help walking. And by the time that he and George Foreman got to go on stage at the 97 Oscars, Ali was 54 or 55 at that point. George had to help him on stage. And seeing that hurt me. It hurt me. I don't know. I guess just because I was a lifelong fan, there was a level of, even though he was just a boxer, right? But seeing him struggle to walk, that was really crushing. I mean, it's like he barely made it on stage. He needed George's help to get up there. And God bless George for being the person that he was, that he ended up being in later years, that he was so jovial and congenial. And then after that, he went into the grilling machine business, and look at how well he did with the George Foreman grill. Knock out the fat. A lot of people didn't even know Foreman was a boxer. People under 30 probably don't know, by and large. Did you ever wonder why he said knock out the fat with the George Foreman grill? You ever wonder why some of the infomercials he's wearing boxing gloves? It's just a prop. Yeah, I mean, it is just a prop. But I remember, sadly, getting a news story on June 3rd, 2016, that Ali was in the hospital. And the way the story was worded, I started to kind of brace myself for the inevitable. I said, I think this is it. Because he'd had various health issues, and yeah, he just didn't look good. He started having to wear sunglasses in public because, his eyes were starting to get a really bad look to them. And he had moments where he was still kind of playful and active on social media, but he had a lot of days which were probably, just not good, that he was struggling. I don't know that he was necessarily in any pain, but you have the essential tremor, and then you reach a point where the muscles are so rigid with Parkinson's, it's almost impossible to move, and you unfortunately see it now with Michael J. Fox. But when I got the confirmation that he had died, I cried. I was 42 years old. I cried. I mourned as if he had been a family member. He was just a figure from a distance who had a major effect on my worldview and my thought process. And, I was almost inconsolable. They didn't know what to do. Somehow a world without him felt like less of a world. And I wouldn't have necessarily phrased it that way, but I felt that way, and I kind of still feel that way. Even in his later era, he didn't really make too many public appearances. He raised a lot of money for worthwhile charities, and his name still carried so much weight. I mean, his family, they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is one situation where I don't criticize anybody for profiting off of it, because if there's anybody who deserves to have his family, make windfalls because of the person he is, it's them. They get a pass. It's okay. I don't see it in any kind of negative light, because he was a very charitable individual. One of his famous quotes, "Service to others is the rent we pay for our room here on earth." He always believed in doing more for someone else. The kind of idea of treat this person the way that they would want to treat, the way you yourself would want to be treated. He was very aware of these things. And when he passed, he did what was expected. It was an interfaith service. And his old friend, Long Island native, and a friend of my cousin's, Billy Crystal, spoke. And Billy spoke so beautifully, and even Bill Clinton, who may have been one of the presidents I was talking about before, but Bill Clinton had gotten to know him as well, and he spoke at the funeral, and he really spoke beautifully too. And you look at the collection of legends of boxers who showed up for the funeral. George Foreman was invited, and he said that he was just a wreck. He just couldn't do it. It was too difficult. It was too much for him to bear that he had passed. And Mike Tyson said the same thing, but at the last minute, Mike was talked into it. And then he later said, I was happy. I was happy that I went. But you had Lennox, you had Michael Moore, and also Will Smith, who played Ali in the Ali movie. And I think Will's performance is great. The movie it's not one of Michael Mann's best films. I mean, it's good. It's 3.5 stars, but I feel like there was a better movie to be made from his life than that particular one. But what do I know, right? There were a lot of different scripts, though. But the movie is definitely worth seeing if you haven't. Will got an Oscar nomination. He's terrific. He didn't win. I don't remember who won that year. It was 2001. But it's still 9 years later. It feels fresh. It feels like he just passed, even though it's been so many years. And when he died, there were a lot of young people who didn't understand. They didn't understand why the death of a boxer was treated as this international, worldwide event where everything seemed to stop for a little bit of time. And it isn't the boxing. It's the person he was. It was a guy who started off as, rah-rah, American hero, Olympic gold medalist in Rome, age 18. And then he became a villain. He became the most hated man in America for a time. But eventually the country kind of came to its senses and realized that Vietnam was atrocious, and that the peaceniks, such as John Lennon, who had no skin in the game because he was British, and Ali, they were right. They were right for standing up for this is bullshit and saying this is bullshit enough times where enough people said this war is no good. This is unwinnable. What are we even doing there? And then public opinion began to shift. And the Supreme Court ruling unanimously in his favor absolutely helped. They were held in very high esteem. I'm not making any jokes about it. They were held in very high esteem. And there were millions of Americans who took that decision to mean this guy was treated unfairly. I hated his guts, but I'm not so sure that I was right to hate his guts. And then lighting the Olympic flame in 96 when he was 54 and his hands and his arms and his wrists and everything was shaking, but somehow he was able to light that. I mean, that could have been a disaster. He could have dropped it. Oh my gosh, that unbelievable. But he was able to do that in 96. And that was almost like the country officially saying, we've moved past Vietnam. It's now 30 years in the past. The people who needed to forgive him, most of them had. Some people were still mad. But most people said, you know what? He put his money where his mouth was. The guy was willing to throw his entire life away because he believed this in his marrow that he could not take part. He had to say no. Here are the consequences. I take them. Bring it on. 5 years in prison is nothing. Let's go. It's okay. I surrender. I give up. This is what I'm doing. I accept the consequences. There is something to be said for that. Just heaping it on yourself and saying, I didn't mess up. I did exactly what I wanted to do, and I know that there are consequences. So in 2005, President George W. Bush awarded Ali with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And this was another indicator that he hadn't just been welcomed back into the fold. This is a great American, period. This is no longer a polarizing figure. It's a Republican president honoring a pretty progressive, woke as fuck man of color. And W teared up at the ceremony. He embraced him and he said, we've always been in his corner. I've been a fan of this guy since before I was even old enough to throw a punch. And then George W. Bush, actually, it was pretty funny. He stanced like he was gonna like a little shadow boxing with Ali, and Ali went like this as if to say, you're nuts. And that kind of brought the room, everyone in the room was laughing. I think Kareem Abdul-Jabbar may have been honored that day. I'm not sure. Maybe it was James Earl Jones, and I don't remember. There were a number of other super famous people who got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That was a really good ceremony because everybody on there was like, okay, big actor, big scientist, astronaut. It was really something. But to see him that day not moving so well, it was humbling, and everybody kind of felt the same way. It was sad. And we don't need to be sad anymore. It's tough to avoid when you're as big a fan as I have always been. But we can celebrate, and it is so easy now to celebrate the highs, lows, and everything in between of his life because of the magic of technology and YouTube. There is so much incredible material available about him. The Ken Burns documentary, a lot of people said was incredible. But I could talk about him for hours, and I've already run this episode very long, so I apologize. But I thank you all so much for joining me on this hopefully somewhat happy hump day here in New York. This has been episode 536 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you again for joining me here. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then,